Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Tonight, we are going to talk about a phrase that I've been hearing a lot, and I think it is a common phrase that a lot of us are saying right now after we have just completed our first week, for many of us, our first week back to school, and now we're sitting around asking, so now what? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about what do we do now that all of our back to school lessons where we were doing some team building last week, now that those are done, what are we supposed to do now? Now that we are faced with the curriculum and just the complete overwhelm that means we have the rest of the year to teach these 25 plus little bodies in our classrooms, and how are we going to get through all of it and what's our plan? So we're going to talk about that, not because I am not feeling that overwhelmed right now myself, but because sometimes when you just hear somebody else talk out what they're doing in their classroom, it's enough to help ground yourself to understand what do all those thoughts that are in my head, they do in fact make sense, and I can make them come to a reality. So that's what we're going to talk about. If you are new to the Teaching with Inquiry Live show, welcome. Thank you for joining me. My name is Patty. I am a 4-5 split grade teacher in Ontario, Canada, and I am also the teacher blogger behind madlylearning.com. And I come live every week to talk about using inquiry-based learning practices in your classroom and all of the other things that could entail. So again, we're going to be talking about the now what. So now that back to school first week is over, we're now faced with attacking that curriculum. And what are we going to do in our classrooms to get through this stuff before those dreaded report cards come knocking in January and again in June? And I know that seems like a far ways away, but the last thing you want to do is in January be rushing to get those last thing done. So I think it's really important that we start now. So let's talk about what is. So I think it's important to address that it is, for me at least, only the second week back to school. And we still do not have routines set in place and established. So throughout the rest of the month of September, and most likely even into October, especially if you are faced with a reorganization, you're looking at restarting a lot of this again in October after your class has been reorganized due to numbers. But if this is what you are faced with, you are going to be building those routines all the time, all while still needing to cover that curriculum. So what is that going to look like in your classroom, and what's the structure? So I think some of the routines that are really important to focus on through and kind of embedding those routines into the structure are things like building independent work skills. I know that is probably the main focus of what's happening in my classroom right now, is building student independent work skills so that I can actually work with one group of students while the rest of my students are working independently. And this is something that I have to focus on diligently, because it is an absolute requirement if I plan to teach a split and use inquiry-based instruction, that I really help my students to work independently and learn that they have to stay focused and responsible for their own learning, because I am not their police officer that is going to be sitting there with them under my thumb the entire time controlling their behavior. But at some point, I need to establish students' ability to self-regulate their own behavior, and also understand that their inability to regulate those decisions will also lead to some undesirable consequences of perhaps not liking those marks. As I'm also planning on using lots of inquiry this year, it's also extremely important that I be able to build collaboration skills between responsible for their own tasks inside a collaborative group, what that looks like, how we share, how we communicate, and additionally, how we work with people that might not be our best friends. So right now, whenever I'm asking for students to work in pairs, they're naturally gravitating to the students that they are most comfortable working with because they're the people that they're playing with on the playground. Where I want to get them is working with other students that they may not necessarily have a personal friendship with, but they understand that there's classmates that they have value, that they can add and contribute to their own learning, maybe somebody that they wouldn't necessarily anticipate themselves working with. I also like to see students working with a variety of people, including people of other genders or people of other grades in the classroom as well. The third thing I really need my students to learn in terms of routine, and something I need to embed a lot right now into some of my language instruction, a lot of my media and science instruction, is going to be focusing on research skills and how to research and what that's going to look like. So in a lot of my media arts lessons, which I have during library, they're going to be focused on research skills and how we go online and conduct research, how we take jot notes, what is a reputable website, how we find those reputable websites. That's all going to be embedded through my library and media studies, because I need students to be able to find sources of information, both through language when they're writing, say if they choose to write a report, but I also need them to be able to do that through inquiry, primarily because I don't have the necessary textbooks that I require to really delve deep into some of their independent inquiry projects of the ones that they choose to study independently later on. So I really need to be building those skills along with the collaboration and independent work skills. And going hand in hand with research skills is also teaching them how to properly use tech in our classroom, having them understand that those tech devices that I'm putting in their hands are not toys that they're going to be gaming or spending their entire day on YouTube. But what they should be doing, they should be using those tech tools as tools to facilitate learning and not using them as toys, maybe something that they're used to using those devices for when they're not in school and learning. That maybe when they're home, they are fun devices. So really changing their mind shift on how they're using those tech tools. So those are some of the routines that I am going to be embedding in a lot of my lessons. And it means that a lot of what I'm going to be teaching within the next month is going to take me a lot longer than I would suspect it should, say in February or March, because I will constantly be stopping them, reinforcing an expectation, and having them restart that activity, because I really want to enforce what I expect, and I don't want to unintentionally reward certain behaviors by reinforcing them, thinking that it's okay. So if I want specific behaviors during independent work skills, I have to be really diligent about what that looks like, sounds like, and feels like in my classroom. And I do have to stop them when they're not doing that and then reinforce what it is I expect and have them rehearse it again. If I'm not, and I allow behavior or I allow choices that students make that do not follow what I'm expecting, what I'm actually doing by not stopping them is reinforcing the behaviors that I do not want in the classroom, which will then in turn make me trying to get all of that curriculum done just a little bit harder. So those are the routines that I have to be embedded. Now, what do I do in my subject areas? So I'm going to break down what my day-to-day routine looks like within all of those subject areas, just to give you an idea of now what can you do? What might math and language and science and social studies look like in your classroom? And I'll tell you through what it's going to look like in my classroom. So I'll start with math. So I've talked before about how I've dabbled a little bit in spiraling. I'm not quite yet ready to jump full force 1000% into a full-blown freedom spiraling. I'm going to ease myself into it with my own comfort level, because too much change is going to backfire for me. I've learned that enough about myself. So I am going to slowly ease into it, and I'm definitely looking for those opportunities to extend into other areas in terms of discussion where I may have just stayed focused on place value, because that's what I start out with, but I will allow us to extend into other areas of addition and subtraction and measurement and data management as well. So I'm going to allow myself to extend in there. I'm also looking for opportunities and provocations in that would allow me to cover more than one strand in a problem. So in my spiraling video that I had a couple of weeks ago in August, I believe it was on August 6th, that episode I had Shauna from the Rowdy Teacher on, and we talked about spiraling, and we looked at what a week's plan looked like for math. Now I still follow that same plan. So days 1 and day 2 of my schedule, I am doing a 3-part math lesson. So my students come in the morning or the period that they have math, and I start them off with a differentiated math page as bell work to get them started. This is rehearsal and routine for them. It's constant practice of the key learning that we're doing. And it's a really quick way for me to assess and judge how they're doing, and gives me a lot of formative assessment data, which I really like. I like being able to have a quick snapshot really quickly to see progress, because each page looks the same and I can see change over time as to how a student might be doing. So once they've come in and they do that differentiated math page, on day 1 and 2, I pull them to our whole group area, which is a carpet in my classroom, and we do a 3-part math lesson. So we talk about a big problem. We have a number talk or another conversation about how we could solve that problem. We might break into smaller groups or do partner activities. We might talk about that. I might send them off to do that independently. Not so much right now, but we're working towards that, where we give them a problem, they go to solve it. And then that's the working on it stage. Then on day 2, they continue to work on it, and then we bring it back and we really focus on that reflect and connect, and we get them to really talk and understand how they came up with their solutions and why they did that, and looking at a variety of different solutions that might be present in the classroom. So those are the first 2 days. Each day starts with a differentiated math page for bell work. It's a quick check-in to see how they're doing on that main skill. Days 1 and day 2 are simply my 3-part math lesson that I spread out over 2 days. Days 3, 4, and 5, I'm currently building up to this now. My students are not quite ready for it yet, but we're building up to the opportunity to do the math center rotation. So I do 4 rotations. I do math on your own and app attack, which is where they're on technology. I do time with teacher, where they're meeting with me, as well as hands-on math working with manipulatives. And I like to make sure that one of those centers in there is definitely focused on number sense and rehearsal of some of those key number sense skills, so they can have those all the time throughout the year, because they are so essential. So I want one of my areas, whether it's app or hands-on, where they're focused specifically on number sense. And I do that over 3 days, and that allows me to meet with students that may be struggling more than once. And some of my students who are not struggling, I don't need to meet with them quite so long. So the time I spend with each group of students is going to vary based on student need and then my observations. And a lot of my grouping actually for students come out of the information I can collect and organize through my differentiated math pages. So if I'm asking to do place value and I'm looking for students to be able to read, represent, compare, and order numbers, if I have those activities on the morning math page, then I am able to take that and see who is able to do that, who is still struggling, and that then helps me to form my groups for that week as to who I am pulling into those time with teacher groups. And how much time I need to spend with certain students over others. So there's a lot of assessment pieces that I can get in there as well with math page. I can also integrate things like Google Forms and quick check-ins into that, so that they can do a self-assessment quiz, so they can see immediately how well they're doing on what the expectations are as well. And those are all built in. We're not there yet now, but that's where I'm heading. So that's for math. And if at any point in time as I'm going through, you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the comments, and I will be able to answer those as I'm going through. So then I want to talk about language. So I find that language is often one of the spiraling right now for math is proving to be difficult for some teachers because it's new and we're jumping in 2 feet and trying to figure it out as we go. And that's okay, because that's sometimes the fun. Now, language for a lot of teachers is difficult because there is no prescribed units, such as there is with math and science and social studies and even media. For language, in terms of reading and writing, it's very open-ended. The curriculum here in Ontario doesn't give us a lot of structure, and there's a lot of repeat and things that cover different activities, and you're not really sure how all of it fits together. So for me, I like to ground my literacy instruction in a read aloud. So for me, I choose picture books because then I get a much larger variety of texts and mentor texts in which to work with. So for example, I'm going to show you this book. This is one of the books that I will be reading in September. It's called Say Something. And I'll be reading very soon is Thank You, Mr. Fokker as well. So if this is the basis for my read aloud. So this is where all of my language for the week is going to be structured. So this is the starting point for me, is using the picture book. And this is how I've structured Ignited Literacy. So for those of you that have purchased that product, then you will see how I've structured this in a very straightforward way and easy to follow. But I'm going to outline what it is so that you can hear kind of how that's outlined and what that looks like in my classroom. So the basis is the picture book. So I like to make sure that a lot of things all stem from this picture book. So this is what I will read at the beginning of the week. And then I also find a shared reading article that matches a similar theme that might be a nonfiction text. It could be a newspaper article or an article that I've sourced and written myself. And then I also have a guided reading text that goes with it that's also paired with the picture book, so it matches the theme or the feeling of that picture book. So I have a picture book for a modeled reading. I have a shared reading that is similar in a paired text, as well as a guided reading, and sometimes an independent reading that are all similar in nature to the theme of that picture book. Now, I also will pull my spelling and grammar activities as well, using sentences outside of that picture book, and everything that week is centered around this book. Even the student activities, I will give choices for students to write. They can choose their own form of writing, but I will also give them suggestions about things that they could write about. And again, those all come as similar, inspired by that picture book. So everything in my language is grounded in that topic of that picture book. So how I structure my language arts is I follow, essentially it's a lot of 20-minute chunks. I don't really like to go much longer than 20 minutes with my students because I do like to have lots of movement and change. So I start off with 10 minutes of independent reading. I really like having students being able to enter language and start out on that calm footing with an independent reading activity. And it also allows me to maybe do attendance if it's the first period of the day. Once they've done that, I will call them to the whole group meeting area and we will do a reading mini lesson for 20 minutes. Now, this could be where we're just activating prior knowledge and asking questions about the picture book. It can also be about where students are really looking at reading parts of the book. I very rarely will sit and read the entire picture book in one 20-minute session. I really like to be able to dig deep into that. So I like to spread out that picture book again over 1 or even 3 days if it's a really long picture book. Then I like to have a shared reading activity that we can look into the text because the students are seeing it. It's a great opportunity for you to be able to look into things like author's purpose, word choice, and kind of evaluating and analyzing different parts of the text. That's a great way to do those kind of activities through a shared reading, which when it's connected to that picture book, students can see those links. So you're helping them out with things like making connections and doing some inferencing and building even some of that background knowledge that students might require through using paired texts so that they can have a better understanding of that picture book. I will also then have, so after the 20 minutes of that reading mini lesson, students then enter 20 minutes of their Readers Writers Workshop Centers, where they're doing 4 activities. They have respond to reading, work on writing, work with words, and meet with teacher. And part of the work with words is doing spelling as well as mentor sentence activities. So those 4 activities students will cycle through. They do write every single day, and the other 3 activities are rotated through as well. So they have a rotation that they follow through, and they do those independent Readers Writers Workshop Centers 2 20-minute blocks during a 100-minute period. So once they've done their first independent block, I pull them back and we do a writing activities where we're really digging into a writing form, or we're looking at the writing process, or we're looking at spelling, grammar, structured lessons. So we do reading first lessons, and then we do writing lessons, and then they're back in for another 20-minute independent centers where they're doing those 4 activities. And finally, that leaves us with a little bit of time at the end. And that's where I'll start to read a whole class novel, and we'll just have discussions. And that's where I get a lot of my oral language. I also get a lot of oral language when we're talking about this picture book, because you have to remember, when I'm reading the text to students and they're responding to a text that I read, we're actually assessing oral language, not their reading, because in order to assess their reading, they need to be the ones that are reading the text. So that is roughly how I'm scheduling my language. I very much base it all around one picture book and build out from there. Now that means that I'm not doing units on, I'm not doing a making connections unit, I'm not doing a summary unit. I'm embedding those lessons as they make sense throughout the entire year based on what makes sense for each one of those picture books. And I do find that I can actually get through all of the expectations by doing it that way, and have some really good assessment time too. When the students are working independently in language, that is when I'm doing guided reading, as well as when I'm doing writing conferences with students and reading what they're writing and giving them feedback. And that's worked for me for quite a few years. Now, finally, talking about where we're probably using inquiry the most is we are using it in social studies and science. Now, if you're like me and you're teaching a split grade classroom, then you're not only just covering one set of expectations, you're covering 2. Now, I know for a lot of us, it makes sense if we can try to find a commonality where we're teaching one lesson and the students are doing 2 separate activities. Unfortunately, I think, especially for me, if I'm teaching 4 or 5, finding those commonalities between the 2 grade levels isn't always possible. Sometimes you might have it in light and sound, or energy and matter and materials. There might be a few links. I know there's some links in pulleys and gears. There might be some in government, but not enough where you're teaching 1 unit and then covering double the expectations. And not without going over the other expectations, where you're essentially getting one grade giving the expectations of another, which I do like to avoid, and I do like to keep them separate. So how do I teach social studies to a split? Well, I flip-flop. So I have 4 40-minute periods a week of social studies because I teach it all myself to both grades. And I do a flip-flop method. So I do half of my time. So essentially the equivalent of 2 periods a week goes to my grade 4s, and 2 periods a week of my time goes to my grade 5s. Well, the students are working independently when I'm with the other grade. Now, for me, this works, but it means I have to have those independent work skills that we talked about at the beginning. I have to have those built up. Otherwise, I can't teach. And things don't happen. And that's not to say that I don't have students that may struggle with independent work skills, because they certainly do. But it's a matter of training and getting them ready, and really helping those that might really be super struggling at independent reading, giving those students proximity to you, or giving them an alternate expectations and really working with them one-on-one to make sure that they can be successful during that time, and helping to support other students during that time so they're not making it worse for the student that might really struggle with independent work skills. So I do use a flip-flop method. I also have to acknowledge that it doesn't matter how many times I've done inquiry in my classroom, my students are not ready for independent inquiry in September, October, or maybe even November. I have to build in the opportunities for me to use modeled inquiry, shared inquiries, or guided inquiries. They're not ready for independent inquiry activities yet. Not for those big, huge projects that we may want to be able to dive into. I don't normally get into those until at least second term. What I can get into now is smaller chunked inquiries where students can do a little bit. I can scaffold it so we can do it step by step. I can limit the amount of choices that they have. So as much as I want student voice and choice, if I put a narrower focus on what it is they are deciding to study and deciding to dig deeper into, then that allows it to be much more manageable for both me and my students as we're learning to do things like researching and asking questions and being able to come up with a question where there is no answer, and how we sort through that in our brain. Now, the fact that they're able to write independently using whatever form they want during language, and often they're doing a lot of research, that is a huge support to be able to use that skill again in science and social studies. So the fact that I teach my students language and I teach them science and social studies does help, because I can get to a more independent type inquiry a lot quicker. But in September and October, it's about building up that routine and structure and the foundation that I'm going to require so that I can do inquiry. And you can do that with any inquiry unit. You can just simply reduce the amount of independent type tasks that there are there, and you provide more support and more structure within the lessons. And then you gradually release some of the control of that ownership of learning to your students as they're ready. And they'll want it. They want the ability to have control over what they're learning. They want to not always be told what it is they have to do. So I hope that gave you a good idea of some of the routines and structures that might be in my classroom that I am working diligently every minute of every day to figure out how I'm going to get my students to a place I want them to be, and how I am answering that question of, now what do we do? How do I attack the curriculum? What's my plan now that some of that back to school stuff is out of the way? How do I dig into curriculum now? You can't do it all at once. You take it one day at a time. You pick specific expectations that you want to focus on one at a time, and you tackle those. You try not to tackle everything all at once, because it becomes far too overwhelming. And that is what I have for you tonight. So I'm hoping that perhaps that gave you some ideas and helped to reduce some of that overwhelm that you might be thinking. Thanks so much for joining me. We're going to come back live again next Monday night at 9 o'clock to talk a lot more about how we're going to integrate inquiry into our classrooms with our new group of students. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you next week. Bye for now.